Hi, my name is Khem Rogaly. I'm here from Transition Security Project. We are a research centre founded by two NGOs. One is called Commonwealth and one is called Climate and Community Institute. And we work in the UK and in the US. Our focus is on militarization and militarization specifically in the UK and US contexts and the impacts that it's having on our economies, our climate and geopolitical system. We look at the negative consequences of militarism and militarization, and we also look at alternative approaches to security, working with trade unions, with politicians, with policymakers, and also with social movements. So in Europe, we have seen a transformation of militaries and military industries for more than a decade now. While the common story that most people are told is that because of the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, European countries had to increase their military spending. But this story is really missing the bigger picture, which is that military budgets have been increasing very significantly across Europe for more than a decade. So it's a process that has been going on for a long time, and a major cause of this process has been pressure from the United States. So the US has imposed this initiative that they call burden sharing. So what they want is they want European countries to have a strong alliance with the United States, but for European countries to have more powerful militaries, to spend more on their militaries, and ultimately to cut things like public services, social spending in order to have more powerful militaries. So what we've seen really across Europe is a parallel process. Military spending has been going up, and then at the same time, so have imports imports of weapons from the United States. So since 2014, weapons imports from the United States have increased significantly. We've seen overall imports have gone up. They've doubled in Central and Western Europe, and now 2/3 of those imports of weapons come from the United States. So European countries are spending more on their militaries, and they're becoming more closely tied to the US, even as the US behaves more aggressively and more chaotically as a military power itself, and even threatens to do things like invade Greenland. And one thing to understand is that this process has been going on now for the last decade, but it's set to go much further over the next decade. So what we have is a new target of spending for NATO members. And I think it's really important to understand that for these countries which are part of NATO, they are going to have to spend 3.5% of their national income on their militaries, plus an additional 1.5%. This is nothing to do with defense. It's not about defending themselves or having militaries that are for defensive purposes. It is a target that is taken from how much the Americans spend on their military, which is 3.5% of their national income. So to do that, what we have over the next 10 years is that European countries, some will double their military spending and some will triple their military spending, even having increased it massively over the past decade already. So what we're going to see is Europe having a military industrial complex that's very similar to that of the United States and will involve a lot of the same companies as well. So I guess there's a few things to say on this question. The first is that there's the common narrative that you get from politicians and from governments. You see from the European Commission, or you might see in the UK context as well from our government, is that they tell us that this military expansion, this militarization, is going to be good for jobs and good for the economy, and that they're going to create many new jobs that kind of replace that decline of civilian industry. I think it's really important to understand that this is not true. If you look in economic terms, military spending is one of the worst forms of public spending in terms of producing jobs. So per pound or per euro of military spending, you are producing fewer jobs than if you spend on health, on education, even on green industries like solar energy, wind energy, or environmental protection. Military spending is very capital intensive industry, and basically because it's so high tech, it's so capital intensive, it doesn't actually support that many workers per pound of spending. The other thing that's very important is obviously that lots of this money is being used to import weapons. So the money is being taken out of Europe entirely and going to American companies which are then sending the weapons to Europe. So that obviously doesn't produce jobs in Europe. And then the final thing to say is that the quality of these jobs, often we're told that these are really good jobs, that they're secure jobs, that people will have stable employment, that they like working in the military sector. But actually, through my research and through interviewing people who work in the military industry, what you see is that their experiences are often very insecure, health and safety practices are not good, and that they don't have positive experiences of working in the military industry. And a lot of this is because military contracts will be moved around a lot. You might have lots of jobs building an aircraft carrier in one place, and then when that comes to an end, hundreds of workers at the same time will lose their jobs. So really what it creates is a dependency on government contracts and on the particular desires of a military at one particular time, which often change and can result in insecurity for workers. So for the past few years, I've been interviewing workers in the military industry in the UK, partly to understand their experience of work in the military industry and to understand why these stories that we're told about the economic benefits of military spending are not necessarily true. And as I've explained, obviously the military spending is not creating good jobs in the way that we're told, and people's experiences are much more diverse than we're told about. But I've also been interviewing people about the question of industrial conversion. So the question of if they had control over what was produced in their workplace, what could their workplace produce? So would it just have to produce a fighter jet or a warship? Could it produce something else? And really what I found was quite interesting in the UK context, because in the UK we're told that in certain parts of the country we have to keep spending on big military contracts because the only way that these communities can survive is through military contracts. And what I actually found is that often in naval shipyards, you either had workers who were already experienced in working in other industries, in civilian forms of engineering. They might have been building wind turbines, they might have been working on civil infrastructure like bridges, or you even had shipyards themselves that would work in a diversified set of industries across the board, from things like repairing metro trains to working on offshore wind turbines as well. So really what was very clear from this process was that the question of conversion was not something that workers opposed. It was also something that technologically was very feasible to do. And unfortunately, we're now seeing that the question of whether it's technically feasible is being answered in the other direction, because what you have is companies that are working in civilian industries being converted in different parts of Europe to make military products. So they've answered the question that we've been asking for many years of kind of that, can you do this sort of industrial transition? But unfortunately it's going in the opposite direction to the one that we might have wanted. Yes. So there's a long history of conversion in the military industry. In the UK, it goes back to the end of the First World War, where you had both workers and trade unions campaigning to move into civilian products. And you also had companies trying to move into civilian markets because they felt that the war was over and that they needed to find alternatives. And from that moment onwards, you've had different modes of conversion. You've had conversion led by companies, conversion proposed by workers or fought for by workers, and also some cases where governments have tried to stimulate conversion or support it through industrial policy. And what the history tells us is that this form of diversification or conversion into civilian markets, when it's just done by the companies and it's done in the interest of the companies, is very difficult, and it can be insecure for workers, because obviously the company is moving into a competitive market and they're then having to move production, to make new investments, and to compete with companies that might be specialists in that market. For workers, their struggles have shown very imaginative examples and brought forward like visionary proposals of what else they can produce. The most famous example of this is the Lucas Plan in the UK in the 1970s, where workers at a military aircraft company basically designed 150 different products that they could make in civilian markets. And bearing in mind that this was in the 1970s, they were looking at products like wind turbines, like heat pumps, even hybrid vehicles. So they were very much visionaries of their era, and showing that if workers had control of their workplace, that they could really build products and make products that were beneficial to society and in the social interest. But the issue that these workers' plans have faced is that obviously without any support from the state or any industrial policy, they've not been able to move forward, they've not been able to operate at a larger scale. So really what we've been looking at is a combination of the workers' leadership and also the industrial policy and support from the state. Because as we see with conversion from civilian industries to military industries, the state is able to oversee these transitions and oversee these types of conversion, because what we're looking at is fundamentally spending by the government and the priorities set by the government. At the moment across Europe, governments are agreeing with this predominantly US-led agenda of saying we need to invest in a war economy and to create a sort of permanent war economy. But there is an alternative there, which is that if they put the same prioritization into social needs, whether it's into public transport, into green energy, that there would also be demand for industry to supply that. And what we looked at in the UK context is that where we have public companies, whether it's in the transport sector, whether small companies in the energy sector, they could be guided by the state and also work with trade unions to oversee these sorts of transitions in the case of the military industry, so that we can build alternatives to this war economy.